Welcome back to another Unwinding with Fiber and Fabric quilting edition. This is hopefully the second video in a series of tips and tricks and information that will help you get started in patchwork quilting. So, in this episode, this hopefully short episode, I want to talk about prepping fabric. And oh my goodness, if you want to start a social media debate, ask the question, do you pre-wash or not pre-wash your fabrics? It will create a debate. It will always create a debate. So when I started quilting, when I started patchwork quilting intensively 30 years ago, I did not pre-wash my fabrics. One of the wonderful things about not pre-washing 100% cotton fabric is that when you wash it, wash the quilt for the first time, it's going to shrink and pucker, and it's going to hide a lot of your imperfections. But then I had a kid. Specifically, I had two kids, and one of them was a little girl who loved to wear dresses and jumpers and run around in cotton fabric. We couldn't find a lot of clothing at the store to fit her. She was an atypical size. And the little tiny baby doll clothes that were popular at the time just fit her terribly. They were always too long, too narrow, too tiny, too much skin showing, and she hated them. I hated how she looked at them, and she hated them. So, what was a mom to do but to learn how to make dresses and jumpers for her daughter? And my daughter loved jumpers. Jumpers with gigantic pockets. She was just happy as a clam if she had giant pockets on a big poofy jumper. So I went from being a quilter to having to understand sewing, clothes construction. Prior to that, I had made a couple items with some success, but I had a huge learning curve when my daughter came along. And the biggest learning curve I had is if you do not pre-wash 100% cotton fabric and then you make a dress out of it and put it on your daughter and then it has to get washed, it's going to shrink. And it is not going to shrink pretty. It is not going to be a pretty product. It is not going to shrink and have a cute little antique look. It's going to shrink and it's going to look terrible and it's going to be impossible to iron out properly. And it was just a nightmare. So I decided I have to pre-wash my fabrics. And that meant, over the years, I have gotten the habit of any time fabric comes in my home, I wash it. Regardless, I wash the fabric. And just before we moved, I finally got around to sorting through all of my old fabric stash and my newer fabric stash and getting everything pre-washed and everything sorted in such a way as to be much more easily identifiable, easily sourced. So now I can honestly say about 99% of the cotton that's in this house has been pre-washed. There are some scraps that are in little, cut into small squares that may not be the case, but they're usually small enough they'll be okay in a patchwork design. I should be all right. But so the number one reason I pre-wash my fabric is because then it's universal. I know that everything has been shrunk at least once, and second reason, everything has been washed once and I know if it's going to bleed or not bleed. So on that topic, you will hear people say, oh, I've never pre-washed my fabric and I've never had a problem. So to that I say, I question where they're buying their fabric, I question the type of fabric they're buying, and I question how they're washing their finished quilt. If you go and watch my imperfect quilt video, you will see, even when I'm being very, 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 very careful and using all the tips and tricks, I can still have a failure when certain fabrics are involved. There's a huge difference between a fabric that is printed on one side and a fabric that is a saturated dye process. My guess, based on what I'm seeing, is this was threads that were dyed before woven, because I can pull the thread off, and here we go, and it is, if I put this I can pull the thread off. I don't know if you can see it. Yeah. And the thread is colored. Whereas in this case, I pull the thread off and it has a little bit of dye in it, but the front and the back are not the same. This is a print. A print is never going to have as much excess dye as a dye bath. And certain dye baths, certain colors, will bleed more than others. And it doesn't matter if you buy it at a top-end quilting store. It doesn't matter if it's a top-end brand. Because I have had a top-end brand, green, not red, bleed all over everything. And that is after it's been pre-washed. So it's one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that fabrics are not the same. And a fabric made by one designer this year might not be the same as a fabric made by the same designer the next year. There are so many variables in the construction of fabric that you cannot guarantee it. And so if you've been lucky and your color catchers that you throw in your wash have done the trick, kudos to you. But not all fabric is the same. And I like to know what my fabric is going to do before I start sewing it together into a quilt. For instance, I have this fabric and this fabric both purchased from the same company, same line of fabric. This is very stiff. This has been pre-washed and it's very stiff and it's got a different weave dimension to it. You can see the threads differently than you can see this. So this is going to behave differently than this. I want to know that the difference between them is because of the weave, not because of a sizing someone has placed on it. I have another fabric that I purchased. I've washed the thing 3 or 4 times and it's still stiff as a board. It was printed so heavily that the print is almost plasticized. It is not an upholstery fabric, but it might as well be an upholstery fabric. I have used it in a quilt, but I was very careful in what quilt I was going to use it in and how I was placing the fabrics, because it is not going to work as well up against a different type of fabric. And that's the other thing when it comes to washing. After washing your fabrics, you can see, is it going to be a stiff fabric or is it going to be a drapey fabric? Get rid of the sizing and you can tell a lot more about how that fabric is going to hold up. And if I am going to make a scrap quilt, I'm not so worried about the fabrics being placed next to each other. But if I'm going to make something I want to be an heirloom, I want the thickness and feel and weave of the fabric to be very close to each other because it will wear better over time. Of course, if it's an heirloom, the person I'm giving it to may not use it as something that gets washed regularly, but since I mostly make baby quilts, it's going to get washed. And so I'm very conscientious of the feel, the texture, and how to place those together in a quilt. It's not just a matter of what color goes well with what color. It's about, do these two fabrics have the same feel to it? This one is a little bit thicker than this one, and this one is a little bit thicker than this one. But they're all in the same range, and so I feel safe putting them into a quilt together. So washing the fabric, it has a shrinkage, it can show us if it's going to bleed, it can help us remove the sizing so we can get an idea of what its actual weight and texture is. And in the modern day, when we're worried about the things we bring into our home, I'm worried about allergens. And so I like to have my fabric washed when it comes in because I have an issue, especially, actually all my life I've had an issue with cardboard dust. Box dust really causes me to break out in hives, itch like crazy, not fun. But there's tons of other things that are on our fabrics today that may not have been on our fabrics 100 years ago. They're probably on our fabrics in the 50s. They were probably on our fabrics when I was a kid. Of course, I lived on a farm, and there were a lot of things in the air that we no longer allow in the air today. So it is definitely something to consider, washing the chemicals out of it and putting the chemicals we want on it for our purpose. That is another reason to pre-wash. So in prepping the fabric, the other thing that that I do, I'll get to the irons in a minute, but after I have washed it and I have ironed the fabric to where it's pretty flat but not terribly, I'll re-starch things as I cut them down smaller if I need to. One of the things that I do, and I do tend to buy larger sections of fabric these days than smaller. But if you have the opportunity to buy, especially I'll buy them when they're on sale, is after pre-washing, I will fold them around my 6 or 6.5 inch by 24 ruler, and then I'll slide the ruler out, and that gives me a nice thin bolt of fabric. And you notice there's some back here. They stack really well when I am stacking them this way. They can also be folded, and that is how I set them in the bins that I have, is usually folded like this, little rows. So that's how I prep my fabric. It's now ready to go when I am ready to cut out strips. So that brings us to the final piece, the pressing itself of the fabric, the ironing it, and that brings me, there's a thing called Best Press. I've actually never used it. I was always a spray starch and sizing person, but I started having a lot of problems with it getting clogged, the nozzles getting clogged, and it was a lot of waste. So I saw a bunch of people talking about Best Press, but more importantly, I saw a lot of people talking about an imitation Best Press, which is a brand. And I gave it a try, and it works. It's the cheapest vodka I can find, water and lavender oil. And I like the lavender scent. It helps. I have a lot of wool. Lavender is a natural bug repellent, so I do lavender. In this size of bottle, it's 2 shots of vodka, 2 cups of water, 2 drops of lavender oil, and I have a pressing spray that does a phenomenal job getting me the crispness I want for my piecing and most of the time for my machine embroidery. So it's cheap, it's easy to source, I don't have chemicals in the house that are terribly toxic, I don't drink vodka, so the only time it's a special trip to the store. I have a kid in the military, and I keep telling him that now we're no longer close to base, that when he comes to visit, he's going to have to bring me vodka for my pressing spray. Because it works. And you'll hear people talk about, oh, it's got to be potato vodka. No, any alcohol really has a starch in it. Your grain alcohol is a starch. So does it need to be vodka? No, it could probably be grain alcohol. Cheap. That's what you want. Cheap. You're going to be spraying it on your fabric to hold it stiff while you sew and then wash it out. Cheap is a good way to go. But grain has starch in it. Corn starch comes from corn. Wheat has starch in it. Potatoes have starch in it. So that's what we're using as our light starch. If you want something heavier than that, then I would really look into, there's a number of other products out there, and there's one that I have been wanting to try, and if I can remember its name, I may put it here in the video, but, oh yeah, Terrell, I think it's called Terrell Magic. I haven't tried it yet, but I've heard that thing is wonderful for machine embroidery. But for the most part, I'm fine with the vodka and water. Now, the final thing I wanted to talk about in this prepping of fabric is the irons. Now, why do I have 3? Well, I actually have 4. I think my daughter has one somewhere in her stuff too. But I had this iron. I loved this iron. I love an iron that is a non-stick surface. That's a preference I have. And tiny little holes. And I messed up my older iron, and I found an exact duplicate of it. I bought this one while I was trying to find the exact duplicate of this one. Its holes don't make me as happy. These holes can get caught on the corners of the pieces as I'm doing the patchwork. This one has big bursts of steam. I love this for the finish pressing of a quilt top before I'm layering it. I love this for clothing, anytime you need a bunch of steam. I like this one because it's half the weight of that one. And I get a lot of fatigue when I'm doing a lot of the pressing. So it gives me, my light just went out. It gives me, let me see if I can get that. Okay, that's a little better. Sorry about that. So, when I'm doing larger blocks, when I'm doing larger batches of pressing, a larger plate is nice. But I get a lot of fatigue from a heavy iron, so it's nice to have a lighter weight one. And then my favorite, when it comes to patchwork, this is my go-to. I can take it to my sewing station if I want to, but mainly I love this because when I'm doing lots and lots of little pieces and I'm pressing half square triangles open and getting all the little pieces ready for more construction, this doesn't put a ton of strain on my shoulder and back, and so that's the reason I love it. It gets nice and hot. It does the job. It presses it, and it reduces the strain. And if I reduce the strain, it means I can do more patchworking longer. So that's why I have the 3 irons, because they basically, as you get older and things don't necessarily work so well with your body, you spend a lot more money on the things that make it easier to do the task so that you can do the task longer without fatigue. And that is going to bring me to my next quick tip video. If you tune in for this one, it's going to be on what are my cutting tools, what are my measuring tools, what are the tools I use to turn the fabric into pieces that I can sew together. And this one I would advise watching, especially if you're on a budget, because I'm going to talk about how to do it on a budget, and then how, if you have the budget, the tools that will make it easier, for, like in my case, to prevent the strain, having the tool for the specific job. So, I hope you'll come back. I hope my light will stay on, and we will see you again for another Unwinding with Fiber and Fabric shortly. Thank you for joining me. Have a great day.